The smell of hickory smoke drifted across Dan Rivers' backyard as he adjusted the dampers on his custom smoker. 3 briskets had been cooking for 14 hours, and the bark was forming perfectly. Dark, crusty, and beautiful. This was what he lived for. The art of low and slow cooking had consumed his life for the past 20 years, turning a simple hobby into an obsession that had won him more trophies than he could count. His phone buzzed against the wooden table where he kept his temperature probes. Dan ignored it at first. Nothing was more important than these final hours of the cook, but the phone kept buzzing and buzzing. Finally, he wiped his hands on his apron and picked it up. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was from Washington, D.C., government types. Dan had dealt with them before when they wanted him to cater some fancy dinner for foreign diplomats. He answered with a grunt. Dan Rivers speaking. Mr. Rivers, this is Director Williams from the State Department's Interstellar Relations Division. We need to speak with you immediately about a matter of national importance. Dan nearly dropped the phone. Interstellar Relations Division. That was the new department they'd created after first contact 3 years ago. When the aliens had finally made themselves known to humanity, everything had changed. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, technology transfers. But what did any of that have to do with a barbecue cook from East Texas? I think you got the wrong number, Director. I just cook meat. Mr. Rivers, you are the 3-time world barbecue champion, correct? Your expertise in culinary arts has been specifically requested by an alien civilization called the Valdran Empire. They want to participate in what they call a cultural exchange program, and they've asked for Earth's finest culinary expert. Dan looked at his smoker, then at the 3 perfect briskets inside. This had to be some kind of joke. You're telling me aliens want me to cook for them? Not exactly, Mr. Rivers. They want you to come to their homeworld and participate in something called the Great Feast of Unity. It's apparently a high honor in their culture. The diplomatic implications are enormous. This could cement humanity's place in the galactic community. The director's voice carried a weight that made Dan realize this wasn't a prank call. These people were serious, dead serious, and they wanted him to travel to another planet to cook. The idea was so crazy it almost made sense. After all, wasn't food the universal language? Every culture had its cuisine, its way of bringing people together around a meal. What would I need to bring? Dan found himself asking. Whatever you think represents the best of human culinary achievement. You have full government backing. Cost is no object. Dan's eyes drifted to his smoker again. The massive steel contraption had taken him 15 years to perfect. Every weld, every modification, every adjustment had been made with his own hands. It wasn't just a cooking device, it was an extension of his soul, the tool that had elevated his craft from hobby to art form. If he was going to represent humanity's cooking to the galaxy, there was only one choice. I'll need to bring my smoker, and my rubs, and about 50 pounds of different hardwoods, oak, hickory, apple, cherry, mesquite. You can't do proper barbecue without the right wood. Mr. Rivers, we're talking about interstellar travel. Weight restrictions are... Director, you said cost was no object. You want me to represent human cooking to aliens? Then I do it right, or I don't do it at all. That smoker goes with me, or you find someone else. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dan could hear muffled voices, people discussing something he couldn't make out. Finally, the director came back on. Very well, Mr. Rivers. We'll make arrangements for your equipment. When can you be ready to depart? Give me 3 days to get my affairs in order. And, Director, what exactly do these Valdran folks eat? From what we understand, they're carnivorous. Meat is their primary food source, which is why your expertise is so valuable. They've specifically requested someone who understands meat preparation. Dan grinned. Carnivorous aliens who wanted to learn about meat. This was going to be interesting. All right, director, you got yourself a deal. But I'm warning you now, when I'm done with them, they're going to wonder how they ever ate meat any other way. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations. Government agents helped him disassemble his smoker and pack it into specialized shipping containers. His collection of rubs and sauces filled an entire crate. The hardwoods required their own temperature-controlled storage. Dan had never imagined his backyard barbecue setup would be traveling to another star system. His neighbors gathered to watch as the government trucks loaded everything up. Old Pete from next door shook his head in amazement. Dan, you sure about this? Going off to cook for aliens? What if they don't like human food? Dan adjusted his worn baseball cap and looked at the convoy of vehicles carrying his life's work. Pete, good barbecue is good barbecue. Doesn't matter if you're human, alien, or something in between. Low and slow, proper seasoning, the right wood smoke, that's universal. The transport ship was unlike anything Dan had ever seen. Sleek, silver, and massive. It made the space shuttles he'd watched on TV look like toys. The pilot, a serious woman in a military uniform, showed him to his quarters and explained the journey would take 2 weeks through something called hyperspace. As Earth fell away below them, Dan felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He'd cooked for presidents, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries. But cooking for an entire alien civilization? That was something else entirely. He thought about the Valdrons, these carnivorous beings who had specifically requested humanity's best meat cook. They were probably expecting something amazing, something that would show them what human cuisine was all about. Dan smiled as he settled into his bunk. He had his smoker, his rubs, his woods, and 20 years of experience. Whatever these Valdrons were used to eating, they were about to discover what real barbecue tasted like. This was going to be the cook of his lifetime. The first thing that hit Dan when he stepped off the transport was the smell. It wasn't pleasant. A mixture of burned meat, stale blood, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that made his stomach turn. The sky above the landing platform was a deep purple, with 2 suns casting strange shadows across the alien landscape. Cronus looked nothing like the diplomatic briefings had described. Instead of the advanced civilization he'd expected, Dan saw rough stone buildings and primitive facilities. Smoke rose from various locations, but it wasn't the clean, controlled smoke of proper cooking. This was the black, acrid smoke of things burning badly. A massive figure approached across the landing platform. Dan had to crane his neck to look up at the creature. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark scales that reflected the alien sunlight. Its head was reptilian, with rows of sharp teeth visible even when its mouth was closed. Yellow eyes studied Dan with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. "Welcome, human Dan Rivers," the creature spoke in perfect English, though its voice was deep and rumbling. "I am Prime Counselor Drac of the Valdron Empire. We are honored by your presence." Dan extended his hand in greeting, but Drac simply stared at it with curiosity. Right. Different species, different customs. Dan dropped his hand and nodded instead. "Thank you for the invitation, Counselor Drac. I'm looking forward to this cultural exchange. When do we start cooking?" Something that might have been a smile crossed Drac's scaled features. "Soon, human Dan Rivers. Very soon. But first, we must explain the true nature of the Great Feast of Unity." They walked through the alien city, and Dan noticed more disturbing details. The buildings weren't just primitive. They were designed for a specific purpose. Large chambers with hooks hanging from the ceiling. Drainage systems built into the floors. Preparation areas that looked more like slaughterhouses than kitchens. "Your government told you this was a cultural exchange, yes?" Drac asked as they walked. "That's right. They said you wanted to learn about human cooking methods. In a way, this is true. We do wish to learn your methods, but perhaps your leaders did not fully understand our customs. They stopped in front of a large stone building. Through its open doors, Dan could see more of the scaled beings moving about, preparing something. The smell of burning meat was stronger here, mixed with other odors that made Dan's eyes water. Human Dan Rivers, the great feast of unity, is our most sacred ceremony. For thousands of years, we have invited the finest specimens from other species to participate. They are given the highest honor our civilization can bestow. A cold feeling started growing in Dan's stomach. What kind of honor exactly? They become the centerpiece of our greatest feast. You have been chosen not just to prepare the meal, but to be the meal. Your species' unique flavors will be experienced by our highest nobility. This is why we requested your expertise in meat preparation. You will prepare yourself according to your own methods before being consumed. Dan felt the world spinning around him. This wasn't a cultural exchange. This was an execution. A very elaborate, very polite execution. The aliens hadn't invited him to cook for them. They'd invited him to cook himself for them. I see this comes as a surprise, Drac continued, misreading Dan's expression. Do not worry. You will have 3 days to prepare yourself properly. We have studied your species and understand you have elaborate methods of meat preparation. We wish to experience these methods applied to their ultimate purpose. Dan's mind raced. 3 days. They were giving him 3 days to somehow get out of this nightmare. But how? He was on an alien planet, surrounded by carnivorous beings who could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. His transport ship was already gone, not scheduled to return for 2 weeks. Could I see your current food preparation methods? Dan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Professional curiosity. Drac's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Of course. You will appreciate our traditional techniques. They entered the building, and Dan's worst fears were confirmed. This was indeed a slaughterhouse, but one designed for sentient beings. The Valdrins showed him their method with pride. Live prey was simply thrown onto massive fires and roasted alive. No seasoning, no preparation, no technique. Just raw brutality disguised as cuisine. But as Dan watched the Valdrins work, he began to notice something important. They were terrible cooks. Absolutely terrible. The meat they produced was burned on the outside and raw on the inside. They had no understanding of temperature control, seasoning, or proper preparation. They weren't cooking food. They were destroying it. This is your traditional method? Dan asked. Yes. Passed down through countless generations. The life force is preserved through the flames, and the pure essence of the prey is consumed. Dan looked at the charred, ruined meat and felt something shift inside him. These weren't master chefs. They were amateurs who had never tasted properly prepared food in their lives. And that gave him an idea. A crazy, desperate idea that just might work. Counselor Drac, before I prepare myself for your feast, would you allow me to demonstrate proper human cooking techniques? It would be my honor to show you what real meat preparation looks like. Drac tilted his massive head thoughtfully. You wish to cook for us before we cook you? Think of it as a professional demonstration. You've never experienced human-style food preparation. Wouldn't you want to understand what makes our method special before the final feast? The alien considered this for a long moment. Dan could see the curiosity in those yellow eyes. Finally, Drac nodded. This is acceptable. You may demonstrate your techniques. We will provide you with suitable meat from our stores. Dan looked around the primitive cooking area and then thought about his smoker, still packed in its containers at the landing platform. I'll need my equipment. My methods require very specific tools. Of course, bring whatever you need. As they walked back toward the landing platform, Dan's mind was already working. He had 3 days and one chance to show these aliens what real cooking looked like. If he could impress them enough, maybe he could change their minds about eating him. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had, and Dan Rivers had never backed down from a challenge involving barbecue in his life. Dan's hands moved with practiced precision as he assembled his smoker in the courtyard outside the Valdron preparation facility. The massive steel contraption drew curious stares from dozens of scaled aliens who had gathered to watch the strange human and his mysterious cooking device. None of them had ever seen anything like it. The offset firebox gleamed in the purple light of Cronus's twin suns. Dan had built every inch of this smoker himself, welding heavy steel plates together to create perfect heat retention and smoke circulation. It wasn't just a cooking tool, it was engineering art designed for one purpose: creating the best barbecue in the known universe. "What is this device?" Prime Counselor Drac asked, running a clawed hand along the smoker's surface. "It appears to be some form of enclosed fire chamber. This is how humans really cook meat," Dan replied, loading chunks of hickory and oak into the firebox. "Low temperature, long time, controlled smoke, the opposite of everything you've been doing." Dan had spent the morning examining the Valdron food stores, and what he'd found was both horrifying and promising. Horrifying because it confirmed they'd been eating sentient beings for centuries. Promising because the meat was poorly preserved and the cooking methods were destroying any chance of decent flavor. But they did have some non-sentient livestock. Large, cattle-like creatures from a neighboring star system that the Valdrons had been raising for emergency food supplies. The meat looked promising, and more importantly, Dan could work with it without feeling sick to his stomach. He'd selected 3 large cuts that reminded him of beef brisket, tough, fatty meat that would be terrible with traditional Valdron methods, but perfect for low and slow smoking. If he could transform these tough cuts into tender, flavorful barbecue, he might have a chance at saving his life. "The temperature must remain precisely at 225 degrees, Dan explained as he adjusted the dampers. "Too hot and the meat becomes tough. Too cool and it won't cook properly. This process takes 12 to 14 hours. Several Valdron officials had joined Drac in watching the demonstration. Dan could see confusion in their reptilian features. Their entire cooking philosophy was based on high heat and speed. The idea of cooking meat for half a day at low temperature was completely foreign to them. "Why does the fire not touch the meat directly?" asked another Valdron, this one wearing ceremonial robes that marked him as some kind of high priest. "Because direct fire burns the outside while leaving the inside raw," Dan said, laying the 3 briskets into the smoking chamber. "Watch what happens instead." White smoke began flowing from the chimney as the hickory wood started smoldering. The smell that emerged was unlike anything the Valdrons had experienced. Clean, aromatic smoke that carried hints of wood and meat, without the harsh, acrid smell of their traditional fires. Dan had prepared a dry rub using spices from his personal collection: salt, pepper, paprika, garlic powder, and a dozen other seasonings that he'd perfected over 20 years of competition barbecue. He'd coated each brisket thoroughly, creating a dark crust that would transform into the perfect bark during the long cook. "The seasonings penetrate the meat slowly," Dan explained. "Combined with the smoke, they create flavors that your traditional methods could never achieve." As the hours passed, more Valdrons gathered in the courtyard. Word had spread throughout the city about the strange human and his mysterious cooking device. They'd never seen anyone tend a fire so carefully, adjusting dampers and monitoring temperatures with scientific precision. Dan used the time to explain the science behind his methods, how the low temperature broke down tough connective tissues into gelatin, how the smoke compounds penetrated the meat to create flavor, how the seasoning formed a crust that sealed in juices while developing complex tastes through chemical reactions. The Valdrins listened with growing fascination. They were intelligent beings, and the scientific approach to cooking appealed to their logical minds. They began asking detailed questions about temperature control, wood selection, and seasoning combinations. In our traditional methods, we believed that high heat preserved the life force of the prey, Drac admitted. But you speak of cooking as if it were a form of chemistry. It is chemistry, Dan replied, checking the meat's internal temperature with his digital thermometer. Every reaction has a purpose. Every temperature change creates different flavors and textures. Cooking isn't about destroying the meat, it's about transforming it into something better. After 12 hours, the briskets had developed a perfect dark bark on the outside while remaining tender inside. The internal temperature had reached exactly 195 degrees, the point where the tough collagen had completely broken down into tender gelatin. Dan sliced into the first brisket with his sharpest knife. The meat separated along its natural grain, revealing a pink smoke ring just beneath the dark crust. Juice ran from the cut, and the smell that rose from the fresh slice made several Valdrins take involuntary steps forward. This is properly cooked. Meat, Dan announced, cutting the brisket into small samples. Low temperature, long time, proper seasoning, and clean smoke. He distributed the samples to the gathered Valdrins, including Prime Counselor Drac. Dan watched their reactions carefully as they tasted their first bite of real barbecue. The change in their expressions was immediate and dramatic. Yellow eyes widened in shock. Several Valdrins made sounds that Dan assumed were expressions of pleasure in their language. Drac himself stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, his face showing a mixture of confusion and amazement. "This is impossible," Drac finally whispered. "How can meat taste like this? The flavors are complex beyond anything we have experienced. There are layers upon layers of taste." "And this is just the beginning," Dan said, cutting samples from the second brisket. "Each piece of wood creates different flavors. Each seasoning adds its own character. There are hundreds of combinations possible." The high priest stepped forward, his ceremonial robes rustling. "Human Dan Rivers, in all our centuries of consuming other species, we have never experienced anything approaching this quality of flavor. How is this possible?" Dan looked around at the crowd of fascinated aliens and realized his gamble was working. These beings had been destroying good meat for thousands of years without ever knowing what they were missing. They thought they were culinary experts, but they were actually barbarians who had never learned to cook. "This is what happens when you understand the science of cooking," Dan said, preparing samples from the third brisket. "When you control temperature, use proper seasoning, and treat the meat with respect instead of just burning it." More Valdrin officials arrived as word spread through the city. Each one tasted Dan's barbecue with the same expression of shock and amazement. They began discussing among themselves in their own language, their voices carrying tones of excitement and confusion. Drac approached Dan as the demonstration concluded. "Human Dan Rivers, we must speak privately. What you have shown us today challenges everything we understand about food preparation." Dan began cleaning his equipment, trying to hide his hope. The demonstration had gone better than he'd dared to expect. These aliens were intelligent enough to recognize superior cooking when they tasted it. Now he had to convince them that there was much more to learn. "Counselor Drac, what I've shown you today is basic barbecue. There are dozens of other techniques, hundreds of seasonings, countless ways to prepare different cuts of meat. Your traditional methods are wasting the potential of every ingredient you cook." Drac was quiet for a long moment, staring at the smoker that had produced such miraculous results. Finally, he spoke. "Tomorrow we will convene the full council. They must taste what you have created, and then we must discuss the future of the great feast of unity." The Valdrin High Council chamber was unlike anything Dan had expected. Instead of the primitive stone structures he'd seen elsewhere, this was clearly their most advanced building. Tall columns supported a domed ceiling covered in intricate carvings that told the history of their civilization. Hundreds of Valdrin officials filled tiered seating that surrounded a central platform where Dan had set up his smoker. But it was the smell that really got their attention. Dan had been cooking since before dawn, preparing a feast that would demonstrate the full range of human barbecue techniques: brisket, ribs, pulled pork from the alien livestock, and even some experimental dishes using local vegetables he'd found in their markets. The aroma of properly smoked meat filled the chamber, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that Dan could feel in the air. Prime Counselor Drac stood at the head of the council, his massive frame imposing even among his own kind. "Fellow Valdrins, we have gathered to witness something unprecedented. The human Dan Rivers will demonstrate cooking methods that challenge our most fundamental beliefs about food preparation." Dan wiped his hands on his apron and looked out at the sea of reptilian faces. Every yellow eye in the chamber was focused on him. These beings had been cannibals for thousands of years, convinced that their brutal methods were the pinnacle of cuisine. Now he had to prove them wrong using nothing but properly cooked barbecue. "Counselors of the Valdrin Empire," Dan began, his voice echoing in the large chamber. "For the past day, I've been preparing a feast using human cooking methods. What you're about to taste represents thousands of years of human culinary evolution." He started with the basics, explaining again the principles of low and slow cooking while he sliced the first brisket. The meat pulled apart perfectly, revealing the pink smoke ring and releasing a cloud of aromatic steam that made several Valdrins lean forward in their seats. The first serving went to Drac and the senior council members. Dan watched as they tasted the barbecue, their expressions shifting from skepticism to amazement. The same reaction he'd seen the day before, but magnified across hundreds of faces. "The texture is unlike anything we have achieved," Drac announced to the council. "The meat separates without force, yet maintains structural integrity. The flavors are complex and layered." Dan moved on to the ribs, demonstrating how different cuts required different techniques. These had been cooked with a sweet and tangy sauce that he'd modified using local ingredients. The Valdrins had never experienced the combination of sweet, sour, and smoky flavors working together. "Your traditional methods apply the same technique to every cut of meat," Dan explained as he distributed rib samples. "But different muscles require different approaches. These ribs needed higher moisture and different timing than the brisket." A younger Valdron council member raised a clawed hand. "Human Dan Rivers, how many different techniques exist in your cooking methods?" Dan grinned. This was the question he'd been hoping for. "Hundreds. Smoking, grilling, roasting, braising, sous vide, curing, fermentation. Each technique creates different flavors and textures, and that's before we consider the thousands of possible seasoning combinations." Could see the impact of his words rippling through the chamber. These beings prided themselves on being apex predators, but they were realizing they knew almost nothing about the prey they'd been consuming for millennia. The pulled pork was next, served with 3 different sauce styles Dan had created using local ingredients: Carolina style with vinegar, Kansas City style with molasses, and a Texas style dry rub. Each one demonstrated how the same meat could be transformed into completely different dishes through different preparation methods. "We have consumed thousands of species," the high priest said, his voice carrying a tone of wonder. "But we have been destroying them. We have been wasting the potential of every meal." Dan nodded. "That's exactly right. Good cooking isn't about overpowering the meat. It's about enhancing what's already there, bringing out flavors that the animal never knew it had." As the feast continued, Dan presented dishes that pushed the boundaries of what the Valdrins thought possible. smoked vegetables that were more flavorful than their traditional meat dishes, sauces that combined dozens of ingredients into complex flavor profiles. Even simple bread that he'd baked using local grains, which many Valdrons had never tasted before. The transformation in the chamber was visible. Valdrons who had entered as confident predators were now questioning everything they thought they knew about food. They began discussing among themselves, their voices carrying excitement and confusion in equal measure. Finally, Drac stood and called for silence. "Human Dan Rivers, what you have shown us today has profound implications for our civilization. We must ask you directly. Would you be willing to remain on Cronus and teach these methods to our people?" This was the moment Dan had been building toward. "Counselor Drac, I would be honored to share human cooking knowledge with your people, but I have one condition." The chamber fell silent. Dan could feel the tension as hundreds of predators waited to hear what demand the small human would make. The great feast of unity and all consumption of sentient beings must end. Forever. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Dan could see shock and confusion on the faces around him. He was asking them to abandon their most sacred tradition, the foundation of their entire culture. "You ask us to give up our most honored custom," Drac said slowly. "I'm asking you to evolve beyond it," Dan replied. "Everything I've shown you today was made from non-sentient livestock. The flavors you've experienced, the techniques you've learned, none of it requires consuming intelligent beings. In fact, proper cooking makes even simple ingredients taste better than your traditional methods ever could." Dan gestured toward his smoker and the empty plates around the chamber. "You've tasted what real cooking can do. Your people have been starving their palates for thousands of years, thinking they were dining on the finest cuisine in the galaxy. But you were just burning good meat and calling it tradition." A younger council member stood up. "But our ancestors taught us that consuming other intelligent species grants us their knowledge and strength." "Your ancestors were wrong," Dan said simply. "Strength comes from understanding, not consumption. Knowledge comes from learning, not eating. What I'm offering you is real culinary knowledge that will transform your entire civilization." Dan could see the council members debating among themselves. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was about their entire identity as a species, their place in the galaxy, their future as a civilization. Drac raised his hand for silence again. "Human Dan Rivers, if we agreed to your condition, what would you offer in return?" "I'll establish a culinary academy here on Cronus. I'll train Valdron chefs in every human cooking technique. I'll help you develop new methods using your local ingredients. In 10 years, your people will be known throughout the galaxy not as fearsome predators, but as the finest chefs in known space." The chamber erupted in discussion. Dan could hear arguments in the Valdron language, voices raised in debate about tradition versus progress, past versus future. Finally, Drac stood, and the chamber fell silent once more. "The council will deliberate on this proposal. You will have our answer by morning." As the Valdrons filed out of the chamber, many stopped to examine Dan's smoker and ask questions about the cooking process. Their fascination was genuine, their curiosity intense. Dan realized that regardless of what the council decided, he had already planted seeds that would change this civilization forever. That night, as Dan cleaned his equipment and prepared for what might be his last meal, he reflected on the days, events. He'd come to Cronus expecting to die, but instead he might have started a revolution, not through violence or conquest, but through the simple act of showing beings how to cook their food properly. It was the most human thing imaginable, taking something basic and elevating it to an art form. Steam rose from dozens of smokers arranged across the courtyard of what had once been the Valdron execution grounds. The irony wasn't lost on Dan as he watched his newest students tend their fires with the same careful attention he'd taught them. Where beings had once been prepared for slaughter, young Valdrins now learned the art of temperature control and proper seasoning. The transformation had taken 6 months, but it felt like a lifetime. When the High Council had announced their decision to end the Great Feast of Unity and embrace human cooking methods, it had sent shockwaves throughout the Valdran Empire. Some worlds had rebelled, refusing to abandon their ancient traditions. Others had embraced the change immediately, eager to experience the flavors Dan had demonstrated. When the competition-style ribs were finally ready, Dan personally served them to Ambassador Rel. The meat fell off the bone at the slightest touch, glazed with a sauce that balanced sweet, tangy, and smoky flavors in perfect harmony. The Centauri diplomat's large black eyes widened as he tasted his first bite. "Incredible," he whispered. "The complexity is beyond anything our food scientists have achieved. How many ingredients are in this sauce?" 47, Corvash answered proudly. Each one balanced to enhance the natural flavors of the meat without overpowering them. Dan watched the interaction with satisfaction. His students had not only learned the techniques, they'd embraced the philosophy behind them. Cooking wasn't about domination or destruction. It was about understanding, patience, and respect for the ingredients. The transformation had spread far beyond Cronus. Valdran chefs now operated restaurants on dozens of worlds, spreading their newfound knowledge throughout the galaxy. Former predator species had become ambassadors of flavor, their cooking bringing together civilizations that had been at war for centuries. The Galactic barbecue circuit had been Dan's latest innovation, a series of cooking competitions that brought together chefs from different species to share techniques and push the boundaries of interstellar cuisine. The first championship had been held on Cronus 3 months ago, with participants from over 30 different worlds. "Teacher Dan," called out another student from across the courtyard. "The delegation from Earth has arrived." Dan felt a familiar excitement. His first visitors from home since arriving on Cronus. He'd sent regular reports, back to Earth, but seeing fellow humans would be different. They would want to know how a simple barbecue cook from Texas had managed to transform an entire galactic empire. The Earth delegation consisted of 5 people, 2 diplomats, 2 culinary experts, and 1 person Dan recognized immediately. Chef Maria Santos, his biggest rival from the competition circuit back home. They'd faced off in dozens of contests, each pushing the other to higher levels of achievement. "Dan Rivers," Maria said with a grin, "leave it to you to find the one place in the galaxy where they appreciate good barbecue." "Maria, what are you doing here?" "The Culinary Institute sent me to study what you've accomplished. The reports we've been getting sound impossible. An entire carnivorous species learning barbecue techniques, former cannibals becoming competition-level pitmasters." Dan led them through the academy, showing off the facilities that had grown from his original demonstration. Dozens of custom-built smokers, temperature-controlled aging rooms, and spice libraries containing ingredients from across the galaxy. But the real pride was in his students. "This is Corvash," Dan introduced his star pupil. 6 months ago, he'd never heard of indirect heat. Now he can cook a perfect brisket with his eyes closed. Corvash demonstrated his technique while Maria watched with professional interest. The precision was flawless, the attention to detail extraordinary. When he presented the finished product, Maria tasted it with the skeptical expression of a master. Chef examining competition. Her face changed after the first bite. "This is championship quality," she admitted grudgingly. "Maybe better than championship quality. How did you teach him to balance the seasonings like this?" "The same way I learned," Dan replied. practice, patience, and respect for the craft. Over. The following days, the Earth delegation witnessed the full scope of what Dan had accomplished. They attended a graduation ceremony where 50 new Valdran chefs received their certifications. They observed trade negotiations where alien species bid against each other for exclusive access to Valdran-prepared foods. They saw former enemies sharing meals and discussing peace treaties over plates of perfectly smoked brisket. "You've done more than teach them to cook," one of the diplomats observed. "You've changed their entire culture." "I just showed them there was a better way," Dan said. "They did the hard work of changing themselves." As the Earth delegation prepared to leave, Maria pulled Dan aside. "The Institute wants to offer you the position of Director of Interstellar Culinary Studies. Full tenure, unlimited research budget, your own staff." Dan looked out at the courtyard where his students were tending their fires, each one focused on the precise art of low and slow cooking. Young Valdrans, who had been raised on traditions of violence and consumption, now dedicated to creation and understanding. "Thanks, Maria, but my work here isn't finished. These students are going to become teachers themselves, spreading what they've learned to other worlds. In 10 years, there won't be a species in the galaxy that doesn't know proper barbecue technique." "You're really going to stay? Give up Earth permanently?" Dan smiled, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "Earth taught me how to cook, but Cronus taught me what cooking can accomplish. Besides, someone has to make sure the next generation does it right." That evening, Dan stood in the courtyard of the academy as the twin sons of Cronus sat behind the mountains. Smoke rose from dozens of carefully tended fires, each one producing the clean, aromatic smoke that had become the signature of the new Valdran Empire. His students worked with quiet concentration, adjusting temperatures and checking meat with the dedication of artists perfecting their craft. Former predators had become creators, channeling their natural intensity into the pursuit of perfect flavor. In the distance, ships from a dozen different worlds were landing at the spaceport, bringing visitors eager to experience Valdran cuisine. Species that had once feared these beings now sought them out, drawn by the universal language of good food shared among friends. Dan had come to Cronus expecting to die, invited as prey to a cannibal feast. Instead, he'd sparked a revolution that transformed not just one species but the entire galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be civilized. He'd taken the most basic human skill, cooking meat over fire, and used it to build bridges between worlds. As he watched Corvash demonstrate proper brisket technique to a group of younger students, Dan reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A simple barbecue cook from East Texas had become the most influential human in galactic history, not through conquest or technology, but through the patient art of low and slow cooking. The smell of hickory smoke drifted across the courtyard, carrying with it the promise of perfectly prepared meals and the knowledge that even the most savage traditions could be transformed through understanding, patience, and respect for the craft. Dan Rivers, former prey-turned-galactic culinary master, smiled as he watched his students tend their fires. This was what humans did best. Take something simple and make it extraordinary. "Teacher Dan, the brisket in Smoker 7 is running." "Hot!" called out Corvash, one of his most promising students. The young Valdran had taken to barbecue with an enthusiasm that reminded Dan of his own early days learning the craft. Dan walked over to examine the smoker, built by Valdran engineers to his exact specifications. The temperature gauge showed 250 degrees instead of the ideal 225. "What do you think caused this?" he asked. Corvash studied the setup carefully. "The wind shifted from the east. It's creating more draft through the firebox." "Good. And how do you fix it?" "Close the intake, damper by half, and adjust the exhaust to compensate." Corvash made the adjustments with practiced hands, and within minutes the temperature was back to normal. Dan nodded approvingly. 6 months ago, Corvash had been preparing to participate in his first great feast as a junior executioner. Now, he was becoming a master of low and slow cooking, understanding the subtle science behind perfect barbecue. The Culinary Academy of Cronus had grown from Dan's initial demonstration into a sprawling complex that trained hundreds of Valdran chefs. They came from across the empire, eager to learn techniques that had revolutionized their understanding of food. The curriculum covered everything from basic smoking methods to advanced sauce chemistry. But the changes went far beyond cooking. The Valdran Empire's entire relationship with other species had shifted. Where once they had been feared predators, they were now sought out as trading partners. Species that had fled from Valdran ships now approached them, offering exotic ingredients in exchange for prepared foods. "Master Dan, we have visitors from the Centauri Alliance," announced Drac, who had become Dan's closest ally in the new order. The former Prime Counselor now served as Director of Culinary Relations, managing the Empire's growing food trade network. Dan wiped his hands and followed Drac to the Academy's main hall. 3 beings he didn't recognize stood waiting, their blue-tinted skin and large black eyes marking them as a species he'd never encountered. "I am Ambassador Rel of the Centauri Alliance," the lead figure said in accented but clear English. "We have traveled far to experience what our trade partners call Valdran cuisine. The reputation of your cooking has spread across dozens of star systems." Dan had to suppress a smile. Valdran cuisine? 6 months ago, that would have meant charred, barely cooked meat served with the blood of the prey still fresh. Now it meant some of the finest barbecue in the galaxy, prepared by beings who had dedicated themselves to perfecting the craft with an intensity that amazed even Dan. "We would be honored to prepare a feast for you," Dan replied. "Is there anything specific you'd like to try?" "We have heard of something called competition-style ribs," Ambassador Rel said. "Our traders say they are unlike anything in known space." Competition-style ribs, Dan's specialty, perfected over 20 years of contests on Earth. He'd taught the technique to only his most advanced students, and watching Valdrans master the complex process had been one of his proudest achievements. "Corvash, prepare a full." "Rack using the championship method," Dan called out. "Ambassador Rel, those ribs will take 4 hours. While we wait, let me show you our standard offerings." They moved through the Academy's tasting hall, where dozens of different dishes were, kept warm in holding ovens. Dan explained each one while the Centauri visitors sampled with growing amazement. Pulled pork with tangy sauce, beef brisket with perfect smoke rings, smoked vegetables that had converted dozens of herbivorous species to Valdran cuisine. "This is remarkable," Ambassador Rel said after tasting a piece of smoked salmon-like fish from the Cronus oceans. "How did a predator species develop such sophisticated cooking methods?" "They learned from the best teacher in the galaxy," Drac said with obvious pride. "Human Dan Rivers brought us knowledge that transformed our entire civilization." The story had become legend throughout the Empire. How a human barbecue cook had arrived as prey and left as their greatest teacher. How he'd shown them that true strength came from creation, not destruction. How he'd taken their most savage traditions and transformed them into the finest culinary arts. As the day progressed, more visitors arrived. Traders, diplomats, and food enthusiasts from a dozen different species, all drawn by the reputation of Valdran cooking. The Academy's dining hall filled with beings who had once been enemies, now sharing meals and discussing flavor profiles.